All right, so today we're going deep on the Irish economy. We've got some really interesting stuff to dig into. We've got the 2023 Leaving Certificate Economics Higher Level Marking Scheme and some real world news snippets, too.
Yeah, buckle up. We're going to uncover some pretty surprising economic forces at play here.
I love it. You know what I find really fascinating?
With that,
It's starting with an exam marking scheme.
yeah.
Yeah, because it gives us like this incredibly detailed view of how Ireland approaches economic education. You know what I mean? We're talking like specific annotations, a super rigorous point system. It's
It's intense.
yeah.
It's like they're analyzing ancient manuscripts,
Yeah.
not economics papers, going to these extreme lengths to ensure fairness and consistency.
Exactly. And I think if you connect that to the bigger picture, it reflects a deep commitment to quality and standardized assessments in Ireland. It's almost like they're saying, look, we take economics education seriously, you
Yeah.
know? We want to make sure everyone has a fair shot. That's a good point. But let's be honest, exams can feel pretty abstract sometimes. So let's talk about something that hits a little closer to home. Petrol prices. Remember when they went crazy back in 2022? Broke that €2 barrier?
Oh, I remember that. Yeah. A perfect example of inelastic demand in action, which, by the way, is one of the concepts covered in the exam we were just talking about.
Wait, inelastic demand? What is that?
Basically, it means that even when the price of something goes up, the demand for it doesn't change all that much. Think about like your own driving habits.
Hmm,
Would you really drastically cut back just because petrol went up, I don't know, a few cents?
probably not, no. Unless it was like a huge price hike.
Right. So petrol, for a lot of people, is a necessity. So
Yeah.
even when those prices rise, demand doesn't drop proportionally. And this has major implications
Yeah.
for you as a consumer, but for the government too.
Okay, so for me, it means I'm stuck paying more at the pump. But how does it affect the government?
Well, they have to walk a tightrope.
Right.
They know that if they increase fuel taxes, people aren't going to suddenly stop driving.
Yeah.
So, it's a tempting way to generate more tax revenue.
So even a small price increase means big bucks for the government because demand is inelastic.
Well, yeah, but they have to balance that against the burden it puts on consumers, especially during times when the cost of living is already high. It's a tough call.
Speaking of tough calls and inelastic demand, let's talk about something a little more fun. The Rugby World Cup in France. Remember that question about fixed supply of tickets?
Oh, yeah,
That always makes me think about scarcity.
right. Classic case of perfectly inelastic supply.
Yeah.
No matter how high the demand goes, no matter how much people are willing to pay, there are only so many seats in the stadium.
It's a perfect example of how scarcity drives up prices. Have you ever been like desperate to snag a ticket to a sold out event? What's the most you'd be willing to pay? It's just interesting to think about like how much we value experiences, especially when they're limited.
It is. And it ties into this concept called diminishing marginal utility.
You're just using big words to make me feel
No.
uninformed.
It's pretty straightforward. It just means as you consume more of something, the extra satisfaction you get from each additional unit decreases. So like, that first rugby match you attend, that's going to be incredible. But by the fifth one, you might be a little less thrilled, even if they're winning.
Yeah, even if I could afford to go to every single match, the excitement would fade.
Exactly. And that table in your source material really shows this. You can see how as you consume more, the total satisfaction increases, but at like a decreasing rate. It's like that feeling of having one too many slices of cake.
Mm.
The first few are amazing, but then just too much.
Right, I'm getting hungry now. But before we move on to snacks, let's look at another table, the one about output and total costs for a firm. This one feels a little more business school 101 to me.
It is. But it's so crucial for understanding how businesses make decisions in the real world. Here we're diving into average costs and marginal costs. Average cost is just the total cost divided by the output, while marginal cost is the cost of producing just one more unit.
So if I'm running a business, these costs are basically dictating how much I produce, right?
Right, and it gets even more interesting when you consider the difference between short-run and long-run decisions. In the short run, a business just needs to cover those immediate variable costs to stay afloat.
Okay, so like if I own a bakery in the short run, I need to make enough to cover the cost of flour and sugar paying my bakers.
Exactly. But in the long run, you need to cover all L costs, including those fixed costs that don't change with output, like rent or those equipment loans.
So long-term planning is about those bigger investments that will ultimately allow you to grow. Okay, that makes sense.
Right. Speaking of growth and investments, let's move on to the Production Possibilities Frontier, or PPF. Think of it like a visual representation of trade-offs.
Okay, I'm a visual learner, so walk me through it.
So the example used in the marketing scheme is a digital manufacturing company. They make laptops and tablets. The PPF shows like all the possible combinations of laptops and tablets they could produce with their current resources and technology.
So it's like a menu of choices, showing the different options for production.
Exactly. And the key concept here is opportunity cost. When that company chooses to make more laptops, they have to give up some production of tablets. What they give up is the opportunity cost of producing more laptops.
It's like choosing between spending time working on a project or going out with friends. If I choose to work, the opportunity cost is missing out on the fun.
Perfect analogy. It's a microcosm of the decisions businesses, even countries, face.
Speaking of countries, there's this really fascinating example in the marketing scheme about China. They've been specializing in manufacturing for decades, but now they might be shifting toward high-tech exports.
Right, and that makes perfect economic sense. By focusing on specific products, countries can become really efficient, gain a real competitive edge in that global market. It's like focusing all your energy on being the best baker in town instead of trying to be a jack of all trades.
So specialization can lead to lower costs and higher quality. Makes their products more attractive to buyers around the world.
Exactly. But it also raises questions about what happens to those countries that have been relying on those lower cost manufactured goods.
That's a good point. Okay, enough about factories for a bit. Let's talk about people. The marking scheme mentions something called the Human Development Index, or HDI.
Yeah, the HDI.
Yeah.
It's a great way to measure a country's well-being. Beyond just economic factors like GDP, it considers things like life expectancy, education levels, and income per capita. It gives you like a more holistic view of how well a country is doing.
So it's like a quality of life index.
Exactly. For example, Ireland ranks 8th globally,
Mm-hmm.
while Congo is 153rd. That highlights those massive inequalities that exist around the world.
That's a huge difference. Ireland has a high life expectancy of 82 years and an average of 11.6 years of schooling. Sounds pretty good. But you mentioned inequality earlier. What does that look like in a high-ranking country like Ireland?
That's a really important point. Even in a country like Ireland, which scores high on the HDI, there are still, pockets of inequality. Not everyone benefits equally from the country's economic prosperity. There are disparities in income distribution, access to health care, opportunities for social mobility.
So even though Ireland is doing well overall, there are still people being left behind.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
And the marking scheme actually raises this thought-provoking question. What if Ireland's average life expectancy were to decline? Would we still consider ourselves a highly developed nation?
That's a good question. It makes you think, the HDI isn't just about how long people live, but how well they live.
Exactly. It forces us to think about the underlying factors that contribute to a good quality of life. Is it just about wealth? Or is it about how that wealth is distributed and how it translates into real improvements in people's lives?
So it's not just about the size of the pie, but about how it's sliced. The marking scheme mentions some potential government policies aimed at addressing inequality. Things like investing in education, adjusting the tax system, or even increasing the minimum wage.
Right. And that brings us back to the idea of, trade-offs. These policies can have unintended consequences. For example, increasing the minimum wage might help some workers, but it could also lead to job losses if businesses can't afford to pay everyone more. It's a complex issue, no easy solutions.
It's fascinating how all these economic concepts are, intertwined. But before we get too deep into the theoretical weeds, let's bring it back to a specific industry, dairy.
Yes, the Irish milk market. It's a great example of how market structures can evolve over time. It used to be much closer to a perfectly competitive market, with lots of small producers all selling essentially the same product.
So in a perfectly competitive market, no single company can dictate prices because there's just too much competition.
That's the idea. But over time, the Irish dairy industry has consolidated, with larger companies like Kerry Group and Glanbia gaining a bigger and bigger share of the market.
So it's no longer this idyllic world of small independent producers all competing on a level playing field.
Right. And this raises an important question for you as a consumer. Do you think increased competition or our concentration in the dairy industry is better for you?
That's a tough one. I mean, more competition usually means lower prices, but maybe there's less innovation. I guess it depends on what I value more as a consumer.
And that's the key. It's a question that plays out in industries all over the world. But before we get too lost in cartons of milk, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the circular flow of income.
All right, circular flow of income. Sounds like big picture economics. Do I need to pull out my imaginary whiteboard for this one?
It might help.
Yeah.
Imagine a diagram with households, firms, the government, and foreign markets all connected. Money flows between them as goods, services, and factors of production are exchanged.
Okay, I can picture that. So, like, when I buy groceries at the supermarket, money flows from me, a household, to the supermarket, which is a firm.
Exactly. And that supermarket uses that money to pay its employees, buy more goods, and so on. The money keeps circulating.
So it's like this giant economic ecosystem. Everything is interconnected.
That's a great way to put it. And then, of course, there's the government, collecting taxes and spending money on those public services. And the foreign sector represents trade with other countries.
But wait, what about those transactions that happen, like, off the books? When someone pays for a service in cash and doesn't report it, isn't that a part of the economy too?
That's a great question. And it brings us to this intriguing topic of the hidden economy. In Ireland, like many other countries, there's a whole underground network of economic activity that doesn't show up in official statistics. It could be anything from like unreported income to illegal activities.
Wow, that's a whole other layer of the economy I hadn't really thought about before. It sounds like a bit of a double-edged sword.
It is. On one hand, it can provide income and employment for people who might otherwise be excluded from that formal economy. But on the other hand, it leads to a loss of tax revenue for the government, which can impact their ability to fund public services.
It's a bit of an ethical dilemma, isn't it? Have you ever participated in the hidden economy? Do you think the benefits outweigh the risks? I feel like a lot of people grapple with that question.
It's a complex issue for sure. And it highlights the fact that, economic systems are rarely black and white. There are always shades of gray. And sometimes those lines get a little blurry.
Okay, I'm ready to get out of the shadows and back into the light. The marking scheme mentions a graph showing Ireland's monthly unemployment rate, which was trending downwards from March 2021 to September 2022. That sounds like good news.
It is a positive sign. But remember, there are different types of unemployment. You've got structural, frictional, seasonal, and cyclical. And each one has its own causes and requires different solutions.
So even when the overall unemployment rate is low, there might still be people struggling to find work because of, I don't know, maybe a mismatch between their skills and the jobs that are available, or because they're in between jobs, or those seasonal fluctuations we talked about.
Exactly. And that's where the government's broader economic objectives come into play. They're not just focused on lowering unemployment. They're also aiming for things like price stability, sustainable economic growth, and of course, social and environmental sustainability.
It sounds like they're juggling a lot of balls. Which of these objectives do you think is most important for Ireland right now? I'm curious to hear your take.
That's a great question. And it's one that economists and policymakers constantly debate. There's no easy answer, as each objective has its own merits and trade-offs.
Yeah.
It's like trying to choose between different flavors of ice cream. They're all delicious, but you can only have one at a time. But seriously, understanding these competing priorities helps us evaluate those choices and engage in, like, more informed discussions about the best path forward for Ireland's economy.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to the idea that economics is not just about, numbers and graphs. It's about people, their choices, and how those choices shape the world we live in.
Well said. And on that note, let's take a quick break and come back to explore some more fascinating aspects of the Irish economy.
It certainly is. Speaking of choices, let's take a look at this table. Packed with economic terms. You got GNP, EU subsidies, EU taxes, and even these mysterious adjustments. Might feel like an economic detective trying to decipher it all.
Oh, I'm up for the challenge. But I'm going to need your help to crack the case. What are we even looking for here?
Well, we're given the GDP at current market prices. That's a whopping 426 billion euros. And we need to use the info in the table to calculate the missing values. It's like a puzzle where each piece kind of builds on the last.
Okay. All right, let's start piecing it together. First up is gross national product, or GNP. I remember from my economics classes that it takes into account net factor income from abroad.
You got a good memory. And in this case, we see that net factor income from abroad is actually negative 103 billion euros. That means more income is flowing out of Ireland than is coming in.
Wow, that's a pretty significant outflow. So to get the GNP, we subtract that negative net factor income from the GDP, which gives us 323 billion euros. Okay, what's next?
Now we move on to gross national income, or GNI. This is where those EU subsidies and taxes come in.
Ah, yes, those EU contributions. I always hear people talking about them, but I'm never quite sure how they fit into the big picture.
Well, in this case, we're adding those EU subsidies and subtracting the EU taxes from the GNP to arrive at the GNI, adjusting for those flows of money between Ireland and the EU.
Yeah.
In this case, the GNI ends up being 324.2 billion euros.
Okay, so not a huge difference from the GNP this time, but hold on, there's one more calculation. Modified gross national income, or modified GNI, what's that all about?
This is where it gets interesting. We have to take into account these adjustments, which include things like factor income of redomiciled companies, depreciation on R&D imports, and even depreciation on aircraft leasing. It's a way to, like, refine the GNI, get a more accurate picture of the nation's true income.
You know, I've heard about those aircraft leasing schemes. Apparently, it's big business in Ireland.
Right.
Who knew accounting for airplane depreciation could be so important?
Right. It might seem like a small detail, but when you're dealing with billions of euros,
Yeah.
even small adjustments can have a big impact. And in this case, those adjustments add up to a hefty 89 billion euros, which we subtract from the GNI to get a modified GNI of 235.2 billion euros. Quite a drop from that initial GDP figure.
It's amazing how all these seemingly small factors can add up to such big differences in the final figures. Really highlights the importance of looking beyond those headline numbers and digging into the details of how these economic indicators are actually calculated.
I couldn't agree more. It's about understanding the nuance, the story behind the numbers. Speaking of stories, let's talk demographics. The source material mentions a 7.59% increase in the Irish population between 2016 and 2022.
That's a pretty substantial jump. What's driving that? Is it a baby boom? Are people flocking to Ireland?
Well, the marking scheme suggests a few possibilities. Could be due to an increase in the birth rate, could be improvements in healthcare, leading to longer lifespans, or positive net migration, meaning more people are moving to Ireland than are leaving.
I mean, Ireland has become quite a popular destination in recent years, especially for tech companies and young professionals.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the impact of external events, like the war in Ukraine, which has led to an influx of refugees seeking safety and a new life in Ireland.
It's amazing how interconnected the world is. Global events can have a direct impact on a country's demographics, but I imagine population growth can put a strain on resources and infrastructure.
You're absolutely right. It's a double-edged sword. Increased demand for goods and services can be good for the economy, but it also means the government needs to, make sure there's enough housing, healthcare, education to accommodate that growing population.
A constant balancing act. Okay, let's focus on one specific factor of production that's tied to population labor.
Labor is more than just, the number of people in a country. It's about the skills, the knowledge, the effort that individuals bring to the production process. And one thing that's really crucial for economic efficiency is the geographical mobility of labor.
Geographical mobility. You mean like how easily people can move to where the jobs are?
Exactly. And that mobility is influenced by a whole range of factors, right? Affordable housing, access to good schools, childcare, attractive social amenities, even government support for relocation.
It makes sense. I mean, I wouldn't be too keen on moving to a new city if I couldn't find a decent place to live, or if I was, worried about my kids' education.
Right. And the government can actually play a role in boosting geographical mobility, investing in infrastructure, providing financial incentives for relocation, and creating policies that make it easier for people to move to where those opportunities are.
So it's not just about attracting people to a country. It's about making sure they can thrive once they get there.
Precisely. It's about creating an environment where people can reach their full potential and contribute to the economy in, meaningful ways. Speaking of reaching potential, let's go back to the Human Development Index for a moment and compare two countries on opposite ends of the spectrum. Ireland ranking 8th and Congo coming in at 153rd.
That's a stark contrast, really highlights those vast disparities in living standards and overall well-being globally. Can you break down some of the key differences?
Sure. Ireland boasts a high life expectancy of 82 years, an average of 11.6 years of schooling, and a high GNI per capita of over 76,000 euros. In contrast, Congo struggles with a much lower life expectancy of 63.5 years, limited access to education with only 6.2 years of schooling on average. and a significantly lower GNI per capita of just over 2,800 euros.
Those are some pretty stark differences. It's easy to focus on those positive statistics for Ireland, but, as we discussed earlier, inequality exists even within a high-ranking country.
You're exactly right. Despite the overall prosperity, certain segments of the Irish population face challenges with income distribution, access to quality health care, and those opportunities for social mobility.
And the marking scheme poses this thought-provoking question. What if Ireland's average life expectancy were to decline? Would we still consider ourselves a highly developed nation?
Such a crucial question. It challenges us to think about what truly defines development. Is it just about those economic indicators? Or is it about creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to live a long, healthy, and fulfilling life?
It's about the quality of life, not just the quantity of wealth. So how do we address those inequalities? What can the government do to make sure that everyone benefits from Ireland's economic success?
Well, the marking scheme suggests a few potential policy interventions. Investing in education, skills training, adjusting the tax system to make it more progressive, increasing the minimum wage, or expanding social welfare programs.
These are all important steps, but as we discussed earlier, there are always those trade-offs to consider. Increasing taxes might help fund social programs, but it could also discourage investment and economic growth. It's about finding that delicate balance.
Exactly. Policymaking is rarely about, simple solutions. It's about carefully weighing the costs and benefits, considering those long-term implications, and striving to create a more equitable and prosperous society for all.
Well said. Now, let's zoom in on a potential vulnerability. Finance Minister Paschal Donohoe has highlighted about the Irish economy. He's pointed out that a surprisingly small number of employees and multinational corporations account for a huge chunk of Ireland's tax revenue.
It's true. Just 500,000 workers and 10 multinational companies contribute over 1/3 of the total tax take. Makes you wonder, what would happen if those multinational corporations decided to, pack up and move elsewhere?
That's a scary thought. It seems like Ireland's economy is walking a tightrope, relying heavily on a small number of big players.
It does raise some red flags. What happens if global economic conditions shift and those corporations' profits decline? Or if changes in tax policies make Ireland less attractive to them?
It seems like diversifying the tax base and not putting all our eggs in one basket would be a wise move, but how do you do that?
That's the million-euro question. Could the government incentivize the growth of smaller businesses? Could they adjust the tax system to encourage a broader distribution of income? These are complex challenges, no easy answers.
It sounds like Ireland's navigating a pretty delicate balancing act. On one hand, they've attracted these big multinational corporations that contribute significantly to the economy. But on the other hand, they need to make sure they're not overly reliant on them and that they're creating a more resilient and inclusive economy.
It's a constant challenge for governments all over the world.
Mm.
Now, speaking of challenges, let's revisit unemployment. We were looking at a graph earlier showing a downward trend in Ireland's unemployment rate, but there was a slight uptick. Between May and September 2022, what do you make of that little blip?
Yeah, I noticed that too. It makes me wonder if there are some deeper forces at play or if it was just a temporary fluctuation.
It's a good question. And it's important to remember that, economic data is rarely a smooth, straight line. There are always going to be bumps along the way.
The marking scheme points out that the live register, which tracks individuals receiving unemployment benefits, might not be the most accurate measure of the true unemployment rate.
That's because it doesn't tell the whole story. It includes people who may be working part-time but still receiving benefits, as well as those working in the hidden economy, which we talked about earlier.
That makes sense. So what's a more reliable measure?
The Quarterly National Household Survey, also known as the Labor Force Survey, it's considered more accurate because it uses a larger sample size and asks more specific questions about people's, employment status.
It's fascinating how much nuance there is in interpreting these economic indicators. It's not as simple as just looking at a number and drawing conclusions. Now, I remember from our earlier conversation that there are different types of unemployment. Can you remind me what those are again?
Of course. You've got structural unemployment, which happens when there's a mismatch between the skills workers have and the jobs that are available.
So, if everyone's trained to be a blacksmith, but all the jobs are in software development?
Exactly. Then there's frictional unemployment. That's the natural churn in the labor market as people move between jobs, like that period when you've quit your old job and you're searching for a new one.
And I remember we talked about seasonal unemployment, which is tied to specific times of year, like tourism or agriculture? Is there
Yeah.
one more?
Cyclical unemployment, which is linked to the ups and downs of the overall business cycle. When the economy's booming, cyclical unemployment tends to be low. But when there's a recession, it can spike as businesses lay off workers.
So it's like those waves on the ocean. Sometimes they're gentle, sometimes they're rough.
That's a great analogy. And understanding these different types of unemployment is crucial for policymakers because it helps them, design targeted interventions to address each specific challenge.
It's like having different tools in your toolbox for different jobs. Okay, so we've talked about unemployment, but what about the flip side, full employment? What does that even look like in the real world?
Full employment is often seen as this ideal state where everyone who wants a job and is able to work has one. But in reality, it's almost impossible to achieve because there will always be some level of, frictional and structural unemployment.
So it's like a theoretical target that we strive for, even though we know we'll never quite reach it.
Exactly. But even though it's difficult to achieve in practice, full employment remains an important goal. It represents a state of maximum economic efficiency and productivity, where everyone who wants to contribute can.
And I imagine it has social benefits too. I mean, widespread unemployment can lead to all sorts of problems, right? Poverty, crime, social unrest. It's about creating a society where everyone has a chance to participate and thrive.
Absolutely. But achieving full employment is just one piece of the puzzle. The Irish government also has other economic objectives on its radar, things like controlling inflation, achieving sustainable economic growth, reducing inequality, and maintaining those essential public services like healthcare and education.
It's like they're trying to solve a Rubik's Cube with all these different factors to consider and balance. I imagine there are a lot of tough choices involved.
There are, and these objectives often conflict with each other, creating a complex web of trade-offs that policymakers have to navigate.
For example, pursuing rapid economic growth might lead to, I don't know, environmental damage or increased inequality. Or trying to reduce inequality might require higher taxes, which could stifle economic growth. It's a delicate dance.
Exactly. And understanding these competing objectives helps us, evaluate the choices our government makes and engage in those more informed debates about the best path forward for Ireland's economy and society.
Well said. Now let's shift gears and talk about a massive intervention the Irish government made in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Pandemic Unemployment Payment, or PUP.
The PUP. It was a lifeline for so many people who, lost their jobs during those uncertain times, a way for the government to step in and cushion that economic blow of the pandemic.
In 2021 alone, the government spent 8.8 billion euros on the PUP. That's a staggering amount of money. The marking scheme encourages us to analyze this intervention through a cost-benefit lens. Who benefited and who paid the price?
On the benefit side, we have the hundreds of thousands of individuals who received crucial financial assistance when they needed it most. It allowed them to pay their bills, put food on the table, and avoid, falling into poverty.
And I imagine it had a positive ripple effect. I mean, if people had suddenly lost all their income, consumer spending would plummeted, potentially triggering a deeper recession.
Exactly. The PUP helped to stabilize the economy, prevent a more severe downturn. But of course, there were costs involved. That 8.8 billion euros had to come from somewhere. And in this case, it was funded through government borrowing.
So it's like putting it on a credit card. Eventually, that debt will need to be repaid, potentially through higher taxes or cuts to other programs.
Precisely. It's a classic example of an economic intervention with both, short-term benefits and long-term costs.
Yeah.
And it raises the question, was it worth it?
That's a tough one to answer. I guess it depends on how you weigh those competing values. Economic security, social welfare, and fiscal responsibility.
Exactly. There are always those trade-offs to consider. And it's up to, each society to decide what they're willing to sacrifice to achieve their economic and social goals.
Now let's step back in time to the 1950s and 1960s, a period of high unemployment in Ireland. Back then, the favored economic approach was trade protectionism, right?
That's right. The idea was that by shielding domestic industries from foreign competition, through tariffs and other barriers, you could protect jobs and boost domestic production.
But we've talked before about the potential downsides. Doesn't it lead to higher prices? And less choice for consumers. Seems like it could stifle innovation, too. If domestic companies don't face any real competition.
You're hitting all the key points. And in a globalized world, protectionism can also trigger, retaliatory measures from other countries, potentially leading to trade wars that hurt everyone involved.
So why are some countries flirting with a return to protectionist policies these days? It seems like we're moving in the opposite direction of globalization.
It's a complex issue. Some argue that it's a way to protect, domestic jobs from being outsourced to countries with lower labor costs. Others see it as a way to reduce dependence on foreign countries for essential goods and services, especially in times of, global instability.
I guess that makes sense from a national security perspective. If you're reliant on another country for something essential like, food or energy, you're vulnerable if that relationship breaks down.
Exactly. And some view protectionism as a way to level the playing field, address those trade imbalances. They argue that some countries engage in, unfair practices like dumping goods below cost to gain a competitive advantage.
So it's not as simple as like protectionism is bad or free trade is always good. Really depends on the context, the specific circumstances.
Exactly. It's about finding the right balance between protecting domestic interests and promoting, international cooperation.
Now let's talk about something that's gaining a lot of momentum these days, the circular economy. It seems like everyone's talking about it.
It's definitely a hot topic, and for good reason. The circular economy is all about, breaking free from that traditional linear model of take, make, waste, and creating a more sustainable system where resources are reused, recycled, kept in circulation for as long as possible.
It's like a closed loop where everything gets a second life. But how do you actually make that happen? Seems like it would require a massive shift in like how we produce and consume goods.
You're right. It requires a systemic change. And the source material mentions the Circular Economy and Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2022, which became law in July 2022. It's a sign that the government is serious about this transition and is putting the legal framework in place to support it.
That's encouraging. But even with laws in place, I imagine there are challenges. What are some of the obstacles that Ireland might face in actually implementing a circular economy?
One challenge is changing consumer behavior. We become so accustomed to a disposable culture where it's often cheaper and easier to buy, new products than to repair or reuse old ones.
I'm definitely guilty of that. I know I should try to repair things more often, but sometimes it just seems, easier to buy a new one.
I think a lot of us can relate to that. It's not always the consumer's fault. Sometimes products are designed to be difficult to repair, or they're made with materials that can't be easily recycled.
So it's not just about individual choices, it's about how products are designed and manufactured in the first place.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of infrastructure. Do we have enough facilities to, collect, sort, and process materials for recycling? Do we have the logistics networks in place to support a circular economy?
Those are all important considerations. It seems like making the circular economy a reality is going to require collaboration across all levels, right? Government, businesses, A&D individuals.
You're right. It's a collective effort, and it will require innovation, investment, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Now, let's talk about a specific aspect of the circular economy that really hits home: food waste. The source material highlights the fact that Irish households throw away a shocking amount of food each year.
It's true. On average, each household is responsible for 117 kilograms of food waste annually, costing them between like 400 and 1,000 euros. That's a lot of wasted food and money.
Wow, that's eye-opening. I know I've thrown away my fair share of wilted lettuce and forgotten leftovers, but what can be done to tackle this problem?
Well, there are a few initiatives mentioned in the marking scheme. Public awareness campaigns can, educate consumers about the impact of food waste and provide practical tips. Things like meal planning, proper storage, and getting creative with leftovers.
I love that. Leftover makeovers, turning last night's dinner into a brand new dish. It's like a culinary challenge.
Exactly. It's about being resourceful, seeing food waste as an opportunity for creativity.
Yeah.
And beyond individual efforts, there are things like, increased funding for food waste charities, like Food Cloud, which redistributes surplus food to those in need. It's a win-win, reducing waste and helping those who are struggling.
That's fantastic. And I read about the National Food Waste Prevention Program, which aims to coordinate efforts across different sectors to achieve a 50% reduction in food waste by 2030 It sounds like Ireland's taking concrete steps.
It's definitely a step in the right direction.
Hmm.
But as with most complex problems, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. It's going to take a multifaceted approach to really make a dent in this issue.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk about a sector that's often at the center of those debates about sustainability agriculture.
Agriculture is a vital part of the Irish economy, but is also, a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. The source material mentions a controversial proposal, reducing the national herd of dairy and beef cattle.
Ooh, that's a hot button issue. I've heard people arguing passionately on both sides.
It's understandable. There are strong arguments both for A&D against reducing the herd. Those who support it point to the environmental impact of cattle farming, particularly its contribution to, methane emissions, which are a potent greenhouse gas. They argue that Ireland needs to take bold action to meet its climate targets, and that reducing the number of cattle is a necessary step.
They also argue that the beef industry is already in decline and relies heavily on government subsidies. They say it's not economically sustainable in the long run, and that shifting towards other forms of agriculture, like plant-based food production, would be a more prudent use of resources.
You got it. But of course, there's the other side of the coin. Those who oppose reducing the herd argue that it would devastate rural communities that rely heavily on, cattle farming for their livelihoods. Generations of farmers have built their lives around this industry. And it's not just a job, it's a way of life.
I can see their point. It's not just about numbers and economics, it's about people's lives and the cultural heritage of rural Ireland.
Exactly. And they also argue that it's unfair to, single out the agricultural sector when other industries like transportation and energy also contribute significantly to greenhouse gas emissions.
It's like telling someone to give up their car while everyone else is like flying around the world. So what's the solution?
Well, there are those who believe that instead of drastically reducing the herd, we should invest in new technologies and practices that reduce the, environmental impact. Things like improving feed efficiency, managing manure more effectively, planting trees on grazing lands. All these things can help to mitigate the impact.
So it's not necessarily an either situation. There might be ways to find a middle ground that balances environmental sustainability with the needs of the agricultural community.
That's the hope. But it will require innovation,
Yeah.
collaboration, and a willingness to compromise.
Okay, let's move on to a topic that's directly relevant to consumers. The Deposit Return Scheme, which is set to launch in February 2024.
This is an exciting development.
Yeah.
It's a system designed to, incentivize recycling by requiring you, the consumer, to pay a small deposit when you purchase a drink in a plastic bottle or can. You then get that deposit back when you return the empty container to a designated collection point.
So it's like those old-fashioned glass milk bottles that you used to get back in the day. You pay a deposit, you return the bottle, you get your money back.
Exactly. It's a simple but potentially effective way to reduce litter, increase recycling rates, conserve resources.
I can see how that would work. If people have a financial incentive to return their containers, they're less likely to just, toss them in the trash. But do you think people will actually embrace this new system?
It's hard to say for sure. Some
Yeah.
people might view it as a hassle or an added cost,
Yeah.
especially if they're not used to returning containers.
Yeah, I can see that. It might take some time for people to adjust to the new system, but I think those environmental benefits could be significant. Plus, who doesn't love getting a little cash back?
Exactly. It's a win-win for the environment and for your wallet.
Speaking of wins and losses, let's talk about a real-life case study that illustrates the dark side of market failures. The story of Trafigura, a multinational oil trading company that decided to dispose of its toxic waste illegally in Côte d'Ivoire.
It's a shocking story.
Yeah.
Highlights those devastating consequences of corporate greed and a lack of accountability. Instead of paying for proper disposal in the Netherlands, Trafigura chose to cut corners, dump its hazardous waste in Africa, putting profits ahead of people's health and the environment.
It's heartbreaking to think about the impact this had on the people of Côte d'Ivoire. Over 100,000 people suffered health problems as a result of exposure to this toxic waste.
It's a stark reminder that markets don't always, self-regulate, and that unchecked corporate behavior can have catastrophic consequences.
This case really underscores the need for strong regulations, effective enforcement mechanisms, and a commitment to corporate social responsibility to prevent similar tragedies from happening.
Absolutely. It's about creating a system where companies are held accountable for their actions and where profits don't come at the expense of people and the planet.
Now, let's get back to some economic fundamentals. The marking scheme reminds us about the concept of demand, both individual and market demand.
Right. Individual demand is just, the quantity of a good or service that a single person is willing to buy at a particular price. Market demand, on the other hand, represent that total quantity that all consumers in a market are willing to buy at various prices.
So it's like the difference between me deciding how many apples I want to buy at the supermarket and the total demand for apples in the entire city.
Exactly. And the marking scheme uses a real-world example to illustrate how changes in demand can affect market outcomes. The Irish government's decision to provide free school transport for the 2020-2023 school year.
I remember hearing about that. It was a big deal for families, especially those who were struggling with that rising cost of living.
It was. And from an economic perspective, it's fascinating to see how this policy impacted the market equilibrium for petrol diesel cars.
Hold on. Market equilibrium. Can you remind me what that means?
It's basically the point where the quantity of a good or service that consumers are willing to buy, demand, equals the quantity that producers are willing to sell supply. It's that sweet spot where the market's in balance.
Okay, so how did free school transport shift that balance?
Well, when the government made school transport free, it effectively reduced the demand for cars. Some families who were previously, driving their kids to school no longer needed to, so they weren't in the market for a car.
So fewer people buying cars means lower demand, which would push down the price.
You got it. And that's exactly what happened. That equilibrium price of cars decreased, and the quantity of cars sold also decreased. A clear example of how government policies can have those ripple effects, even in seemingly unrelated markets.
It's like those butterfly wings causing a hurricane on the other side of the world. It's amazing to see how interconnected everything is.
It is. And speaking of unexpected consequences, the marking scheme points out this interesting twist. The rapid introduction of free school transport led to a huge surge in demand for bus tickets, with an additional 6,000 tickets needed in late September 2022, after schools had already opened.
Wow, that's a lot of extra tickets. Sounds like the government might not have fully anticipated the scale of that demand.
That's a possibility. And the marking scheme frames this situation as a potential, government failure.
A government failure? Why? It sounds like they were trying to do something good, providing free transport.
It was a well-intentioned policy.
Yeah.
For sure. But the problem was that the inability to meet that increased demand for tickets left some families stranded. They were promised free transport, but there weren't enough buses to go around.
So it's a reminder that good intentions aren't always enough. You need careful planning, accurate forecasting, and efficient execution to make sure a policy actually delivers.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the concept of market failures.
Right.
We've already talked about the Trafigura case, but the marking scheme provides another scenario that raises questions about the, effectiveness of markets in achieving those optimal outcomes.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's this other scenario?
It describes a situation where the Irish government intervened in the electricity market to provide households with a €200 electricity credit in response to those, rising energy prices.
I remember that. Energy prices were through the roof. That credit was a welcome relief for a lot of people.
It was. And the rationale behind the intervention was to, shield consumers from the full impact of those price increases, especially those on fixed incomes who might be most vulnerable to rising costs.
So it was a way for the government to step in and correct a market failure, recognizing that the market alone wasn't going to provide those affordable, essential services to everyone.
Exactly. But as with any intervention, there are potential downsides. The marking scheme asks us to think about the economic disadvantages of this electricity credit. What are your thoughts?
Well, for starters, that €200 credit represents a significant chunk of government spending. That money could have been used for, other things, like investing in renewable energy or improving healthcare.
That's the opportunity cost we talked about earlier. Every choice has a trade-off.
And another thing that strikes me is that the credit wasn't means tested. So even wealthy households who could easily afford the higher electricity prices received the benefit. Was that really the most efficient use of government funds?
That's a valid question.
Yeah.
Could the money have been targeted more effectively to those who, really needed it? And there's also the question of whether this intervention addresses the root cause of the problem. Does it incentivize energy conservation? Or does it just, temporarily mask those underlying issues driving up prices.
It seems like there's always a risk that government interventions can have, like, unintended consequences, or even create distortions in the market.
You're right, it's a delicate balancing act. While government interventions can play an important role, mitigating those negative impacts of market failures, it's crucial to weigh the costs and benefits carefully and consider if there are, more effective long-term solutions.
It's about finding that sweet spot between government intervention and letting the market do its thing. Okay, let's look at another type of market intervention. The windfall tax on energy companies' profits that was introduced in Budget 2023.
Ah, the windfall tax. It's a controversial measure, always sparks heated debates. Basically, a windfall tax is a one-off tax levied on companies that are experiencing, unexpectedly high profits, often due to factors beyond their control, like rising commodity prices.
So in this case, the Irish government was basically saying, hey, energy companies, you're making a killing off these high energy prices, so we're going to take a slice of those profits and use them to help people who are struggling with the cost of living.
That's the gist of it.
Yeah.
And similar measures were being implemented across, the EU at the time.
I remember there were strong opinions on both sides. What were some of the key arguments for and against the windfall tax?
Those who supported the tax argued that it was, a fair and necessary way to ensure that energy companies were contributing their share. During a time of economic hardship, they pointed out that these companies were benefiting from a situation that was causing, real pain for consumers, and that it was only right for them to share some of the burden.
It's like that old saying, when times are good, we all prosper together. But when times are tough, we all share the pain.
Exactly. And they also argued that the revenue generated from the windfall tax could be used to fund, targeted support measures for those most affected by rising costs, like low-income households and vulnerable groups. It was seen as a way to, redistribute some of that wealth.
Yeah.
And provide, much-needed relief.
So it was about addressing economic inequality and making sure that those who are benefiting the most from the, high energy prices were also contributing to helping those who are being hit the hardest.
Precisely. But of course, there were those who opposed the windfall tax. They argued that it was a, distortionary measure that would discourage investment and innovation in the energy sector. They worried that companies would be less likely to invest in, new projects or technologies if they knew that their profits could be subject to these unpredictable one-off taxes.
Yeah. It's like a game with constantly changing rules. It's hard to plan for the future when you don't know what the, tax landscape is going to look like. I can see how that would make businesses hesitant.
Exactly. It creates this cloud of uncertainty and unpredictability, which can make it harder for businesses to, make those long-term decisions. And some critics question whether the windfall tax would actually be effective in helping consumers. They argue that the revenue generated might not be enough to, offset the rising cost of living, and that it might be more effective to focus on addressing the root causes of the energy crisis, like those supply chain issues and geopolitical instability we talked about earlier.
So it's another example of those tricky trade-offs, trying to balance the need to address immediate problems with the potential long-term consequences.
A classic economic dilemma. Okay, let's shift gears and dive into the world of market structures again. This time we're looking at an example that's close to many Irish hearts, the market for milk.
Ugh, yes, the humble pint of milk, a staple in every Irish household. But I have a confession. I don't actually know much about the economics of the, milk market. Is it like a cutthroat competition between all these different brands?
It's interesting you should say that, because the Irish milk market used to be a much closer approximation of what economists call, perfect competition. Imagine a market with lots of small producers, all selling essentially identical milk. No single producer has enough power to, control prices. So the price is determined by the forces of supply and demand.
So it's like a level playing field where everyone has an equal chance.
Exactly. But over time, the Irish milk market has consolidated. Larger companies like Kerry Group and Glanbia have emerged and now control a significant share of the market.
So it's no longer this perfect world of small producers competing on equal footing.
Not quite. And the marking scheme asks us to, identify the characteristics of a perfectly competitive market.
Okay. Let's see if I remember from my economics classes. We've got a large number of buyers and sellers, homogeneous products, no barriers to entry or exit, perfect information, and firms aiming to maximize profits. Did I miss anything?
You got them all.
Yeah.
But as we've seen, the Irish milk market no longer ticks all those boxes.
Hmm.
The main reason is, there's a concentration of market power in the hands of a few dominant firms.
So those big players like Kerry Group and Glanbia have more influence over prices because they control a bigger chunk of the market.
Exactly. And another factor is that there's more product differentiation these days. You've got all these different types of milk, low fat, full fat, organic, lactose free. It's no longer just a, simple homogeneous product.
So the Irish milk market is a good example of how real-world markets often deviate from those, theoretical ideals.
It is. And the marking scheme introduces a tool for measuring market concentration, the
Yeah.
Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, or HHI. It's basically a mathematical formula that tells you how concentrated a market is.
Okay, so a high HHI means there are a few big players dominating the market.
You got it. And for Irish dairy producers, the HHI is over 3,000, which indicates a highly concentrated market.
But wait, isn't market concentration always a bad thing? I mean, sometimes bigger companies can produce things more efficiently because of economies of scale, right?
You're absolutely right. It's not always black and white. Market concentration can lead to benefits,
Yeah.
lower production costs, increased efficiency. But it's important to, monitor it carefully, make sure it doesn't lead to anti-competitive practices that
Yeah.
harm consumers.
So it's like walking a tightrope, trying to harness the benefits of larger companies without letting them stifle competition.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance. Now, let's explore the economic advantages and disadvantages of, a perfectly competitive market.
Okay, let's see. On the plus side, perfect competition is supposed to lead to lower prices for consumers
Mhm.
because businesses are constantly competing to offer those, best deals. It should also lead to greater output because firms are incentivized to, produce as much as they can to meet demand.
You're on a roll. And there's also the concept of allocated efficiency, which basically means that resources are being allocated to, their most valued uses. In a perfectly competitive market, the price of a good or service reflects its true value to society.
So it's like an invisible hand guiding the market towards the most efficient outcome.
That's the idea. But there are potential downsides to perfect competition as well.
Hmm.
One concern is that it can, stifle innovation. If companies are constantly focused on cutting costs to stay competitive, they might not have the resources or the incentive to invest in research and development.
It's like that saying, penny wise and pound foolish. You might save money in the short term by not investing in, innovation, but you could fall behind in the long run.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And another potential drawback is that perfect competition can lead to, a lack of product differentiation. If everyone's producing essentially the same product, there's less incentive to be creative or to, cater to those niche markets.
So it's a trade-off. While perfect competition has its benefits, it's important to recognize that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Absolutely. And that's true for most, economic concepts.
Okay. Ready to delve back into the circular flow of income?
I'm ready. My imaginary whiteboard is all set up. Great. Remember, the circular flow of income is all about, showing how money flows between different sectors of the economy. Households, firms, the government, and the, foreign sector. It's this constant cycle of income and expenditure that keeps the economy moving.
So households provide labor and other factors of production to firms. Firms use those factors to produce, goods and services, and then households use their income to buy those goods and services. It's like a giant interconnected web.
Exactly. And the government plays a role by collecting taxes and spending money on public services. And the foreign sector represents trade with other countries, which can bring in additional income through exports or lead to, outflows.
Through imports.
But wait, we talked about injections and leakages earlier.
Right.
How do they fit into this circular flow model, right? Injections are things that, ADD to the circular flow of income, like government spending, investment, and exports. They boost economic activity. Leakages, on the other hand, are things that withdraw from the flow, like savings, taxes, and imports. They reduce economic activity.
So if the government decides to invest in a big infrastructure project, like building a new highway, that's an injection into the circular flow. It creates jobs, boosts demand for materials, and stimulates the economy.
Exactly. But if individuals decide to, save more of their income, that's a leakage. It reduces the amount of money circulating in the economy.
It's like those dams on rivers that control the flow of water. Injections open the floodgates while leakages restrict the flow.
That's a great analogy.
True.
And the balance between injections and leakages is crucial for the overall, health of the economy.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get a better grasp on the circular flow concept. It's amazing to think about all these, different factors interacting, influencing each other. But before we wrap up, let's talk about a topic that often operates in the, shadows of the formal economy, the hidden economy.
The hidden economy.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. It's all those economic activities that are, not recorded. In official statistics, think of cash transactions, unreported income, and of course, illegal activities.
It's like an underground economy operating beneath the surface of the, official economy.
Exactly. And it has a number of effects on the Irish economy.
Yeah.
One of the most significant is the loss of tax revenue for the government. When transactions happen off the books, the government misses out on, collecting income tax, VAT, and those other taxes that fund public services.
So it's like a leaky faucet, draining away resources that could be used to, support essential services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure.
That's a great way to put it. And the hidden economy can also distort the labor market. Workers in the hidden economy often work for lower wages and without the same protections and benefits as those employed in the formal economy.
So it creates this unfair competition for businesses that are playing by the rules, paying their taxes. And it can lead to, exploitation of workers who are desperate for income and might be willing to accept those lower wages in worse conditions.
Exactly. And because the hidden economy is, hidden, it makes it difficult for the government to accurately measure and manage the economy. It's like trying to, navigate a ship in foggy conditions. You don't have a clear view of what's ahead.
It makes sense. If a significant portion of economic activity is happening, under the radar, it's hard to get a true picture of how the economy is actually performing.
Right. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with some of the pieces missing. Okay, let's shift our focus to those fluctuating values. That can make or break international trade. Exchange rates.
Yes. Exchange rates, they always seem a bit mysterious to me. I know they go up and down, but I'm never quite sure, what makes them move.
It's like a giant global currency dance with all these different factors influencing each other. And the marking scheme gives us a real world scenario to illustrate how exchange rate fluctuations can impact the Irish economy. We're given a graph showing the euro to sterling exchange rate from September to November 2022. And what we see is that the euro depreciated against the sterling during that period, falling from 0.90 to 0.86 per pound.
So basically the euro weakened against the British pound.
Exactly. And that seemingly small shift can have, big ripple effects throughout the Irish economy. Think about Irish businesses that export goods to the UK. A weaker euro is actually good news for them.
Why is that?
Because it makes their products more competitive in the UK market. If the euro is weaker, it means that UK buyers can get more euros for their pounds. So Irish goods become, relatively cheaper.
That makes sense. So a weaker euro can boost exports, but I imagine there's a flip side to this coin, right?
There is. A weaker euro also makes imports from the UK more expensive for, Irish consumers. If you're buying something from the UK, you're now getting fewer pounds for your euros. So the price goes up.
So it's a bit of a mixed bag. Good for exporters, but potentially bad for consumers facing those higher prices for imported goods.
Exactly. It's a classic trade-off. And the marking scheme then poses this provocative question. Should the Irish government be concerned if the euro to dollar exchange rate is, appreciating?
That's a tough one. It seems like there would be pros and cons to a stronger euro, just like with a weaker euro.
You're right. A stronger euro can boost the, purchasing power of Irish consumers and businesses. It means that imported goods and raw materials become more affordable.
So it could help to lower inflation and make it cheaper for businesses to operate.
Exactly. But on the flip side, a stronger euro makes Irish exports more expensive for buyers. Using other currencies. It can hurt the competitiveness of Irish businesses in those global markets.
It's that trade-off again, trying to find that sweet spot between supporting domestic consumption and keeping Irish businesses competitive on the global stage.
It's a delicate balancing act. And it highlights the interconnectedness of global markets and that complex web of factors that can influence exchange rates. Everything from, interest rate differentials to political stability to investor sentiment
Mm.
can play a role.
It's like a giant economic ecosystem
Hmm.
with all these different species interacting and influencing each other.
That's a great way to put it. And it brings us back to one of the overarching themes we've been exploring throughout this deep dive: sustainability.
The sustainability has definitely been woven throughout our conversation. We've talked about the environmental impact of agriculture, the challenges of transitioning to a circular economy, the economic costs of food waste, and the ethical implications of, corporate behavior.
It's no longer just a niche issue. Sustainability is becoming a core principle that needs to guide economic decision making at all levels.
The marking scheme shows how this sustainability mindset is starting to shape policies and business practices in Ireland. We've got the deposit return scheme to incentivize recycling, the focus on reducing, food waste, and those debates over the future of agriculture.
These are all positive steps,
Yeah.
but there's still a long way to go. It's a journey that requires collaboration, innovation, and a willingness to challenge that status quo.
It's about recognizing that economic growth can't come at the expense of, the environment or social well-being. We need to find a way to create a more sustainable and inclusive economy that benefits everyone now and in the future.
Well said. And as we wrap up our deep dive into the Irish economy, we leave you with this final thought-provoking question. Based on everything we've discussed, do you feel, optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the Irish economy? What are your biggest takeaways from this, exploration?
The Irish economy is facing a complex and ever-changing landscape with both opportunities and challenges on the horizon. Its success will depend on its ability to, adapt, innovate, and prioritize sustainable and inclusive growth that benefits all members of society. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.